man sits on his chair, flipping through thousands of legal documents. He doesn't take breaks or get distracted. He is relentless. Contrary to what you might believe, he is not studying for a degree or being overworked at a desk job. He's a convicted felon. He's in a prison library. He once pulled hundreds of thousands of dollars from ATMs across California while dodging IRS criminal investigators. It was kind of a hobby that went feral. He started by browsing online fraud forums as a kid. But now, locked in a cell, his only shot at freedom is buried somewhere in the dry paperwork of access to information requests tied to his case. After months, his eyes land on a single mention of a word, a secret that the FBI never wanted exposed. The US government was now in big trouble. It was the ticket that would set him free, if only he could prove what he saw to be true. This is the story of Daniel Rigmaiden. When Daniel was a kid, his family didn't have much money. So one day, he asked his mom, why couldn't they just get more cash from the ATM? She told him it wasn't that simple, but Daniel wasn't convinced. While other kids dreamed of scamming gumball machines, he dreamed of cracking ATMs. Had the gumption to actually do it. Because growing up in Monterey, California in 1980, his main hobby was skating, back when that was a counterculture thing to be doing. Since skate parks were rare, him and his friends, they got used to running from annoyed police officers and security guards as they were popping kickflips on private property. For him, the chase wasn't a downside, it was part of the thrill. His skating friends described him as someone who was not afraid to do things everyone else was scared of. He had little regard for authorities. And researching Daniel, I think that's a key part of his personality, an attitude that would carry into his next obsession, technology. When his mom brought home a Commodore 64, Daniel fell in love, started making his own programs. But this would get the wheels turning in his head. These new electronic systems that were taking over the world, they were built by people like him, and people were fallible. Therefore, there had to be a way to break them to his advantage. There's one other piece of the puzzle that I think drove Daniel to do what he did. He was growing up in a toxic environment. Said he had a bit of an angry home life, lived kind of on edge. And so it's no surprise that when he graduated high school in '99, he quickly left his hometown. But his run-ins with the police would now be much worse than a few skateboarding chases. As a young adult on his own, he got caught shoplifting. He managed to plead the charges down, would only get probation and have it completely expunged from his record after completion. Daniel thought that he got an easy break. But on his way out of the courthouse, a county detective stopped him and demanded to search his car. That was not good news for Daniel. Inside, the detective found piles of hotel receipts with names, addresses, and credit card numbers of people who had checked in. Each one was a felony possession charge relating to credit card forgery. Daniel was cuffed on the spot, arrested, and spent the next 3 months in county jail. And that's where everything changed. Daniel was determined to do no more time, no matter what. So when he eventually got his charges down to misdemeanors in court and was given another 3 months to complete his sentence, he decided that he wasn't gonna do it. He ran. And at that moment, Daniel became a fugitive. Over the next few months, he would change identities. First, going by Chris Donnelly, and soon more to come. From here on out, survival meant deception, and he was about to become immersed in shady online forums to do it. You see, Daniel was pretty smart, and people always say we inherit our wits, but to be honest, I'd never really looked into my own background. That changed when I came across today's sponsor, MyHeritage. Check it out, I added my parents and grandparents, and almost instantly, they began uncovering things I never could have found on my own. For example, I learned that my great-grandfather founded a rubber company in Ohio before World War II. But what really got me wasn't the business, it was the story behind it. He came from Europe with nothing but a trade skill and a dream, built a factory from scratch, and somehow kept it running through the Great Depression. Seeing his old photo, then colorizing it and bringing it to life with MyHeritage's deep nostalgia feature felt like meeting him for the first time. I also learned that my great uncle, Robert Reed, served in World War II. MyHeritage surfaced an old photo of him in uniform. I'd never seen it before. When I restored and colorized it, he suddenly didn't look like a stranger from a history book anymore. He looked like family. It's a strange feeling, meeting your own relatives decades later. through a photo. Going through it all with my mom really made me stop and think about how much of life connects back to the people you've never even met. Some people even discover kings and queens in their family tree. With over 36 billion records, MyHeritage makes it easy to uncover stories like that. Just scan the QR code or click the link in the description or first comment to claim a 14-day free trial of their complete plan. Thank you, MyHeritage. Daniel threw himself into Shadow Crew and Carter Planet, two of the big cybercrime forums of the early 2000s, looking for ways to make money. If you've seen my series on raid forums, you understand how these operate. Shadow Crew was mostly tailored to fake IDs, while Carter Planet was for stolen credit card details. Of course, people abuse these things in every way conceivable and unconceivable, and so other niches of fraud were of conversation too, some of which Daniel would slowly learn as people came to trust him. For now, he was new, settled on becoming a fake ID vendor. Over time, selling these online would become his primary income. But while he was building a reputation on these forums, in real life he was trying to keep his entire identity a secret while not missing out on his 20s. He drifted between different college towns in California, was blending in with students his age, would say he's going to this university and taking these classes, but it was just all made up, attending parties but under fake names, because of course he was a fugitive on the run. But as you can imagine, this wasn't exactly easy to keep up with. He had to keep his story straight, couldn't meet people who knew him by one name when someone was there who knew him by another, so on and so forth. By the time he was 25, he never wanted to work again, wanted to make enough money to flee the United States to some cheap country where he could live a good life. But he knew that fake IDs weren't going to cut the bill. But he had developed a reputation on the forum now. Other prolific members knew him, trusted him. So Daniel wasn't surprised when another well-known guy, operating under the handle Gollum Fund, saw some potential in him. First, he asked Daniel if he had access to bank accounts. Lots of them register under different names. Of course, Daniel was able to get those. That's where being able to fake identities comes in handy. Then, Gollum said he knew about a tax refund scam, told him it worked by filing returns for recently deceased people in their name and directing the returns to those fraudulently registered bank accounts. Gollum even had access to a private database with records of recently deceased people, including all their private information, like social security numbers, and that was key for this to work. He shared it with Daniel. It all kind of added up too, because months prior, Gollum Fund had made this post on the forum saying that he was getting out of things. Perhaps he had already made his nut and was being generous sharing this information. Daniel thought, as a prestigious member of the forum himself now, that this was just what happened. This guy was his peer. Little did he know, Gollum Fund, indeed a very clever fraudster, was actually telling him all of this from a war room while in Secret Service custody. Gollum's real name is Brett Johnson. He had fled the forum when he realized it was being monitored by the feds months prior. That's when this post went up, but it was too late. They caught up with him. He had been committing this tax fraud scheme himself, was taking home $160,000 a month, did all the work manually. Took him 6 minutes to file one tax return document. He'd spend 8 to 10 hours a day doing it fully locked in, then spend hours and hours going to different ATMs to cash it all out. But now, he had been busted and he was cooperating with the Secret Service. They were using him not only to catch other online bad guys, but to also educate them on how the entire scheme worked, so they could later work with banks and the IRS to try and rectify the situation. That's why he was sharing this information with Daniel, to set him up. As luck would have it though, Gollum was still actually breaking the law while in Secret Service custody. In fact, he was running the same tax refund scheme when the agents weren't looking over his shoulder. Eventually, they did catch on though, and so his access was revoked. They took the laptop away, they put him back in a cell, and so this conversation with Daniel was stopped before it materialized into a big Hollywood sting operation. Daniel, of course, didn't know of any of this. What he did know was that this tax scheme worked really damn well. Except, unlike Gollum, he couldn't be bothered to do all the tax returns manually, and he was savvy enough with programming to automate the entire process. He wrote a program that would pull a person's name from his recently deceased database, then look up their employer identification number on another database he managed to get access to. It would take all of that, automatically fill out an IRS W-2 form, and then he would connect to websites like H&R Block to use their online filing systems. It meant that all he had to do was collect the money. but this was actually the most labor-intensive part because the returns were being sent to these prepaid debit cards, and they had to be cashed out through ATMs. This was the safest way to do it. It became his full-time job, 8 to 10 hours a day, often late at night. The withdrawal limits on the cards were frustrating. Some would have daily thresholds of only a few $100s. Good ones, he'd be able to take 1,000 out. He would often go out, do the withdrawals, stay up past midnight. That way, the limits would reset and he could do it all over again. On a good day, he would be netting around $30,000. Of course, we know by now that Daniel had a very high risk tolerance, and that meant that he wanted to push this to the limit. And of course, that also means that things were about to get very risky.
Sometimes society gets overwhelming for someone who doesn't really agree with participating.
Daniel, needing a break from ATMs, took off to the Padres National Park in Southern California. In the wilderness, Daniel found peace, climbing trees, sleeping under the open sky. He even built himself this raft.
The Los Padres National Forest in California. It was just kind of a way to get away from a system that I didn't agree with, I suppose. And I was just kind of taking a break from society at that point.
But eventually, the money called him back. He drifted between different hotels, would use his laptop to fire off more tax returns, and cash out at ATMs. When exhaustion hit, he'd head back to the trees. But that cycle couldn't last. If he wanted to disappear overseas, he needed more than just his own two hands stateside to run the operation. He wanted to outsource the riskiest bits, the collecting of the physical debit cards and the cashing out at ATMs, so he could just sit back on his laptop and file the returns with his automated software. It's at this point that Daniel went back online to try and recruit some help. He built a small network, accomplices who would open the bank accounts to funnel the refunds, others who would pick up the prepaid debit cards and actually collect the money from ATM machines. Everyone was operating under handles, but Daniel had developed a strict set of rules to make sure that he didn't get caught. He was paranoid, and to his credit, he did a great job of covering his tracks, but one of his workers, a Phoenix man named Ransom Marion Carter III, wasn't as cautious. In 2007, the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Unit, these guys might as well be FBI agents, by the way. They're sworn federal law enforcement officers with much of the same power. They've got the badge, they've got the firearm. They got a call from a commercial mail receiving agency about a strange P.O. Box customer. The worker noticed that Carter's box was overflowing with 26 prepaid debit cards, all registered in different names. Significant deposits labeled tax refunds were also being sent into his Compass bank account labeled Carter Tax and Accounting LLC. This raised some eyebrows with the IRS investigators. In these cases, they normally like to interview the victims, the people who were named on those tax returns, but they quickly realized they were all dead. The money was coming from fraudulently filed tax returns. But before they managed to get a search warrant for Carter's residence, he moved and disappeared. Initially, agents thought that this was their man, but they soon figured out that he was just some sort of low-level henchman, that there was someone far above him that was giving Carter the orders, someone who was actually making the fraudulent filings in the first place. But upon tracing the online records to see how these returns were actually filed, well, it was a dead end. It was hidden behind VPNs and botnets and proxies. They didn't know who the big boss was, but for now, they nicknamed him the Hacker. And it's at this point that the investigation was truly opened. An undercover investigation was launched immediately. Agents opened a bank account in Arizona and infiltrated Daniel's network. How they found him online isn't clear. What the records do show is that someone already in his circle flipped. The government only ever refers to them as confidential informant number 2. The idea was simple: pose as a new collaborator, accept tax refunds into their Arizona account, and it worked. Believing they were part of his crew, Daniel funneled stolen tax refunds straight into this FBI-controlled account. His cut was supposed to be $68,000. And in sending this money back to him, they hoped that it would lead straight to him. It was a follow-the-money investigation. This was going to be the only way they were going to bust him, because his online presence was so carefully hidden. But the process was not how they expected. Daniel sent step-by-step instructions to the confidential informant by email. First, he wanted all of the money washed in lantern fuel so drug dogs wouldn't pick up on it. Then it was to be double sealed in vacuum plastic, hidden inside a child's toy, then gift wrapped with a card stuck on top for a sick child. They had to send back by email photos that they followed all of these steps before Daniel sent them an address. They were hoping it would be to a residential spot like a house, but instead it was to a 24-hour FedEx in Palo Alto. The package was to be addressed to a Patrick Stout. The agent set up a 24-hour surveillance team in front of the shop. Since he could show up whenever, they were settling in for a long shift. They hoped that he would arrive soon after the package was marked as delivered, but it wasn't until a whole day after, at 5 a.m., that they watched a hooded man walk into the store. He showed the clerk at the desk his driver's license. It read Patrick Stout, but he refused to let them hold it. And instead of taking an offered pen by the worker to sign for the package, he pulled out his own, signed the paper, careful to not touch the sheet with his fingertips. Then he took the package and was off. The chase was officially on. An agent started tailing the hooded man. Daniel spotted him. The odd behavior set off alarms in his head, and so he slipped into a counter-surveillance mode, cutting down side streets, doubling back, trying to lose the tail, but nothing was working. Maybe he was just being paranoid, but if the follower was law enforcement, he was finished anyways. So he made a bold move. He stopped in the middle of the street, turned fully around, and walked straight towards the man shadowing him, heart pounding, ready to bolt if grabbed. But nothing. He walked straight on by. In reality, the agent had another plan. They weren't sure if this hooded guy was the big boss or just someone paid to pick up a package. So they wanted to wait till whoever this was got into a car so they could follow them home, perhaps find the big boss that way. What they didn't expect was for their suspect to dart into an alley, rip open the parcel, take the money out, stuff it into their backpack, and then make a beeline for the Caltrain platform. By the time the agents scrambled up the stairs behind him, the train was already pulling away, southbound. He had slipped right through their fingers. They had been outwitted. Daniel had no idea the feds had almost grabbed him. To him, it was just paranoia. So when the confidential informant came back asking for more work, Daniel just sent off more fraudulent tax returns to his account. For investigators, it was a consolation prize. They hadn't caught him, but the informant's relationship with him was that much stronger, and they were going to use this to their advantage. They had the informant write Daniel an email, told him that he had friends in banking, someone that could clear massive amounts of money without raising any eyebrows. Daniel took the bait, sent even more transactions, but the real hook, the informant told Daniel that his banker friend could get funds unlocked from other banks. See, this was a big problem in the whole fraud. Banks would often lock these accounts up for suspicious activity, and so the funds couldn't be withdrawn from them, and there was no real way to get that undone since, of course, these were all registered under stolen identities. Daniel sent the informant a list of accounts that had been locked over the years. The investigators couldn't believe it. This was enough evidence to make a headline conviction, but still, they didn't know who he was. The IRS was closely monitoring the IP addresses for all the fraudulent returns being made, but every time they were hidden behind proxies and VPNs. Till June 1st, 2008. One of the IP addresses on one of the returns, well, his VPN connection must have dropped because it traced back to a Verizon Air card purchased as a mobile hotspot under the name Travis Rupard. The feds quickly found out that this was a fake identity, and so that was another dead end. Till they thought to subpoena Verizon. Verizon had historical records of the air card communicating with cell towers, and doing an analysis on those locations, they were able to figure out that this person was in California. In fact, they were able to determine that he lived in Domicilio Apartments right next to Santa Clara University, just blocks away from a train station. But through normal triangulation, this precise of a location shouldn't have been possible. It was time for them to set their trap. The informant emailed Daniel, said that his next cut was $352,000, that all the cash was ready. Daniel provided the same instructions as last time, and the informant sent back picture proof. Once again, agents set up 24-hour surveillance at the FedEx, and also this time, Daniel's apartment. The package was shipped and delivered, but for 4 days, he didn't show up. Finally, on August 3rd, 2008, he left the apartment at 4:15 in the afternoon. He closed the gate behind him, and an agent started trailing him. Daniel noticed, got nervous. What started as a fast walk suddenly escalated into a sprint. He managed to evade the agent at first, but then the agent called for backup. He was spotted by some police officers, tried to make a desperate run, but the two cruisers closed in on him. One of them was able to deliver a small blow to his leg with its tire. He fell to the ground, and in a matter of moments, an officer had pinned him down. It was over. In the meantime, more agents swarmed into Daniel's apartment. His laptop was left running, complete with the air card. They found $116,000 in cash, $208,000 worth of gold coins, and $10,000 in silver. The FBI also found emails regarding paying Dominican country officials for a birth certificate, passport, and a Belize residency guide. In addition, they found many prepaid debit cards and even a passport facially matching Daniel registered under a deceased person's name. Back at the station, things weren't going so well. Daniel was refusing to give his name, insisted that they just call him Sir, and he had scratched his fingertips so bad during the fall that they couldn't even take prints. It took a week for his fingers to heal, and only then were they able to confirm his identity, Daniel Rigmaiden. During that time, Daniel couldn't believe it. He was racking his brain. Everything he did was calculated. There was no way that they could have found him. He knew it had to do with the air card, but how were they able to find his apartment from it? It shouldn't have been possible. Daniel was accused of stealing more than $4 million, but he had only actually got his hands on around $500,000. The rest had been frozen in locked accounts. This was the result of nearly 1,900 fraudulent tax returns filed, spread across 170 different bank accounts. Daniel would later insist that the $4 million figure claimed by the government was actually inflated. That's what he tried to take, but only $2.2 million in refunds ever actually came through, and of course a bunch of that got locked, and so he only got his hands on that $500,000. Either way, he was facing a huge list of charges. Mail fraud, wire fraud, access device fraud, tax fraud, fraud against the government, aggravated identity theft. He was facing a potential of 14 to 17 years in prison. During the pre-trial litigation, Daniel was sent to a private detention center in Florence, Arizona, and there, his mind kept circling back to one thing: the air card. It must have been it, but nobody knew where he lived and no one ever followed him home. It didn't make sense how they could have located him by normal means. His court-appointed attorney got him a copy of the search warrant affidavit used to obtain a warrant for a physical search of his apartment. Reading through it, Daniel found a paragraph about how the agents located him, quote, cell tower information and other investigative techniques. But Daniel knew how cell towers worked. At best, Verizon could tell investigators which tower his air card pinged, but that would only narrow it down within a 4-mile radius. How did they get his exact address? What were the other techniques? In prison, another inmate, John Wigglesworth, suggested to Daniel that it seemed like the investigators had used some form of electronic surveillance, but had not gotten an order to do so as legally required. This was just enough to send Daniel down the rabbit hole. He spent as much time as they would allow him, just 3 hours a week, in the prison library conducting research. He would later argue to get this upped to 5 hours a week. His biggest problem was digital law was still the Wild West in 2008. There was only a handful of cases similar to Daniel's. His appointed lawyers were far from experts in the field. So Daniel chose to fire them to represent himself in court. The court tried to persuade him not to do it because usually this is a very stupid idea, but Daniel was no ordinary man and it was his right to defend himself, so they were gonna have to let him. Daniel would later say, quote, when you hire an attorney, they have to pick and choose the things they're going to challenge because of time and resources, but I just challenged everything. The legal war had begun. Daniel believed a high-tech cell phone tracking tool was used to locate his apartment, but he needed to find something to prove it, and so he started requesting every document related to his case. Boxes and boxes of papers were arriving at the detention center, and he started combing through them. All the while, he's writing these handwritten motions to send back to the court. Most of what he got back was completely irrelevant, but Daniel had to go through it anyways, just in case. He couldn't afford to miss a single detail. After an overwhelming 14,000 pages of documents, Daniel opened the second to last box and took out a paper. There, he came across a single word, a slip-up, in an email exchange between an FBI agent and a US postal inspector. They used the word Stingray. The moment Daniel saw the word, he knew this was it. But the page offered nothing more than a mention. To dig deeper, he needed the internet, and behind bars, now 2010, yeah, he'd been in for 2 years, that was no easy feat. Despite representing himself, Daniel had a shadow counsel of sorts, a lawyer on the outside named Dan Komarauer. Whenever Daniel needed to Google something, Komarauer would do it for him, print the search results off, mail them into the prison, and then Daniel would circle the pages that he wanted. Then Komarauer would look them up and print them out and send those into a painfully slow process, but Daniel, well, he had nothing but time. That's when he discovered the truth. The Stingray device was built by the Harris Corporation, a big-time US defense provider, and every purchase came with a non-disclosure agreement that kept it out of public records. Judges really had no idea that this thing existed, defense attorneys certainly didn't either, and law enforcement wanted it that way. So what exactly was a Stingray, and why was it so powerful that the FBI risked their entire case just to keep it a secret? A Stingray is what's known as a cell site simulator. I think it's best to let Daniel explain this one.
It's a miniature mobile cell tower operated by law enforcement, and it's without the knowledge of the service provider, and it forces all compatible cell phones in the area to connect to the equipment. And its purpose is to identify the phones and to locate the phones with high precision. So it's going to get a lot more precise than if they're just relying on the real-time cell site information or E911 type stuff. And it does masquerade as a legitimate service provider cell tower. So they're going after like a Verizon phone in this scenario. That's what they're doing. It's actually going to have to pretend to be a Verizon cell tower. It's going to transmit certain codes that will trick people's phones into thinking that it's a Verizon tower and cause phones to connect to it.
So it exploits the design of cell networks. Your phone, or air card in this case, is always listening for the strongest tower signal. The Stingray tricks it by pretending to be that tower. Picture this: a police van rolls up a few blocks from your house, and suddenly the fake tower is stronger than the real one 5 kilometers away. Without knowing any better, your phone connects. Agents do this until they get the one that they want to connect, and then they can drive around a little more. This lets them calculate the target's device location with apartment accuracy. And once that building is located, a handheld device like this can be used to literally find the room that device is in. For Daniel though, one thing was clear: there was a huge problem with the legality of Stingray devices. Daniel wanted to prove in court Stingray was a violation of his Fourth Amendment right. The Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable searches. Normally, if the police want to search your apartment, they need a warrant. They want to wiretap you, they need a warrant. But Stingray was muddying that line all up because when using it, it didn't just track one suspect, it forced every device nearby to connect, meaning that police were essentially searching hundreds of bystanders at once, people who weren't suspected of anything, people they certainly didn't have a warrant to search. The Constitution doesn't allow law enforcement to snoop on everyone just because one person is under investigation. That's a massive breach of privacy that opens the door to all sorts of abuse. And Daniel was going to fight this, but first, he needed the public to know. So he started contacting journalists, scholars, researchers, and lawyers, but nobody was paying any attention to him. Till late summer of 2011, a PhD student and principal technologist of the American Civil Liberties Union, Chris Sagoyan, received an email. Daniel was emailing him because the ACLU is a non-profit organization dedicated to defending the individual rights guaranteed by the Constitution. But Chris was used to getting these sorts of emails from prisoners, usually with all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories, hoping to get out on some crazy whim, but this time it wasn't the case.
Handwritten letters, sometimes from jail. Some of these letters include references to mind control or aliens or Fidel Castro controlling their brain via radio waves. And in 2011, I got one of these, and it was something to the effect of, the government has tracked me using a secret surveillance device that sent signals through the wall of my house. And they don't want to talk about this device, they don't want to talk about the technology, but I think you'll be interested to learn what I found.
But what really stuck out to Chris is that Daniel had included a massive document with his email.
It must have been 200 pages, and it was meticulously written, which is even more surprising when I learned that it had been written in a jail library without an internet connection. And what he'd done is he'd collected every single publicly available source he could on Stingrays and built this argument to support the idea that the government had used this technology to find him. It was fascinating because it was the most well-researched memo I'd ever seen on this technology. written by a guy, rotting in jail.
Upon reading Daniel's document, Chris was immediately captivated. He couldn't keep this to himself, so he shared it with the Wall Street Journal. And on September 22nd, the story of Stingray and its potential misuse hit the newspaper headlines and dominated TV channels primetime. Daniel had become a sort of martyr for privacy, but still, this didn't solve his immediate problem of trying to win this case. Daniel had never been to law school, but in front of a judge, he argued like someone who had passed the bar. Daniel's entire defense was to file a specific motion to suppress the evidence they obtained using their Stingray device. Because if he could suppress the location of his apartment, then they'd have no case, because all of their evidence stemmed from what they found inside. But before storming Daniel's apartment, the FBI had secured 2 pieces of paper they were arguing allowed them to do it. The first was a search warrant that Daniel quickly tore apart. Daniel's argument was that the information they provided to the magistrate judge was insufficient to authorize the conduct that they undertook to locate the air card and subsequently his address, and that there were violations of other people's rights because for a very brief time, the federal government had a location of all the other devices that communicated with their Stingray. Daniel was arguing that this did not comply with the particularity requirement of the 4th Amendment. Particularity meaning that if the government seeks authority to conduct a search or seizure, they need to explain specifically what it is that they are going to search and what it is that they are going to seize. Daniel's main argument here is that their warrant request did not lay out in detail how the Stingray operated. The second order was for a pen register for which no probable cause was needed. These orders are less powerful than warrants and are usually used to obtain phone numbers dialed from a device, not location, but the feds were arguing anyways that them finding his location through the Stingray fit into the pen register order too. And truly, there was no definitive answer to this. Situations like these are handled case by case, judge by judge. So Daniel sat on his side of the courtroom alone, against, on the government side, an army of lawyers. Come June 4th, 2012, his motion to suppress was officially filed. Quote, "Through this motion in the attached documents, the defendant respectfully requests that the court suppresses all evidence and derivative evidence stemming from the government's air card locating mission. If the judge approved this paper, Daniel would walk out a free man." And the judge didn't like the fact that, for more than 15 years, law enforcement had kept judges in the dark about these devices. It was only Daniel who finally forced them to admit to their existence in open court. Still, this wasn't an easy decision to be made. The judge was taking his sweet time. August 20th, 2012, more than 4 years after Daniel Rigmaiden was caught on the streets of Santa Clara, the whole courtroom hung on Judge Campbell's words. This was it, the moment that could rewrite history. Once the precedent is set, there was no way back. The motion to suppress was denied. The judge acknowledged that the investigators could have been more transparent with their wording when filing for the warrant, but he said they hit on enough valid points to authorize what they had done. It meant that Daniel wasn't getting out, but he wasn't done fighting. He would file 22 more motions to continue the trial and started challenging everything that he could. The government was having a hard time keeping up with him, and at that point, they already had no choice but to admit that they used a Stingray. In a way, they'd already lost a big part of the battle and they knew it. So in late summer 2013, they offered Daniel a plea deal. To quote Daniel, "The reason they wanted to get rid of the case wasn't because they were worried Stingray was going to get exposed more, because at that point it was pretty much already out there. The reason they wanted to get rid of me was because I was doing all that work. I was giving them so much work to do and it was pushing their resource limit. If he took the deal, it would keep him from appealing the case, but he would receive time served behind bars and be released from prison." Daniel was suspicious, so the negotiations took a whole 9 months. In the end, he went through with it. He was sick of life in prison. On the 7th of April 2014, after more than 1,130 motions and hearings, Daniel finally walked out. He spent 5 years and 8 months of his life behind bars. If he had let his court-appointed attorneys take the stand, it could have been 17. But what about all that money that he stole? All that gold that they confiscated? When the feds seized Daniel's stash of gold and silver, the IRS wanted to liquidate it immediately, but prosecutors had a different idea. hold on to it, in case the opportunity came up to use it in front of a jury as evidence. They knew that would hit hard, but that decision turned out to be a jackpot because by the time Daniel cut his plea deal, the gold and silver had skyrocketed in value. After they sold it and accounting for the seized cash and frozen accounts, the government didn't just recover the stolen tax refunds, they actually made a profit thanks to Daniel's investment. As a free man, Daniel still had dues to pay, 3 years probation and 100 hours of community service. He split his time between a soup kitchen and an internship at the ACLU, where he actually ended up working alongside Chris. He gave lectures about Stingray. He was serving his time, spreading his knowledge, and raising awareness about the thing that the feds never wanted to come out. At that time, Daniel also started his news platform, FDJ News, focusing on privacy, security, and surveillance. Even after finishing the hours, Daniel stayed with the ACLU. Him and Chris made nice progress over the years. They helped expose the FBI non-disclosure agreements that barred local police from ever mentioning Stingray in press releases, court, or anywhere else, and they exposed how those agreements even advised prosecutors to cut plea deals or drop cases entirely if disclosure came too close. Check it out, this order reads, quote, "In any manner including but not limited to press releases and court documents, during judicial hearings, or during other public forums or proceedings." With this out in the public, the FBI issued a strange statement, quote, "The non-disclosure agreement should not be construed to prevent a law enforcement officer from disclosing to the court or a prosecutor the fact that this technology was used in a particular case. Defendants have a legal right to challenge the use of electronic surveillance devices, and not disclosing their use could inappropriately and adversely affect a defendant's right to challenge the use of the equipment." Meanwhile, they did the exact opposite in Daniel's case. They tried to make sure it wasn't disclosed. This was a big crack in the feds' whole shtick around Stingray, and so the ACLU sued, and by September 2015, the feds were now forced to get warrants for most Stingray deployments. Privacy advocates called this a win, but Daniel wasn't so sure. Quote, "A lot of it is just putting a new face on what they've been doing all along. In my case, they had a warrant. The problem was the information on the warrant." Daniel has remained a consultant on government surveillance technology for defense attorneys, journalists, and government transparency advocates. In 2007, Daniel's initial impulse was to escape from the system, to amass wealth, and to distance himself from it. After trial, there was no more running. Daniel faced the system head on. If he left society, he would only help himself. He made the decision to fight back. Today, he is still a vocal privacy advocate. And another big thanks to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. Start uncovering your story today with 14 days free. Scan my QR code on screen or click my link in the description or pinned comment.